A retired Navy SEAL and his K-9 find a bound officer buried in the snow, but the name he whispers changes everything. Because some ghosts don't haunt places, they haunt unfinished promises. Snow pressed its hush over the Montana Valley the way a hand settles over a restless heartbeat. It lay unbroken from the ridge lines to the frozen creek bed, smooth and endless, swallowing trails, fences, and intentions in one soft, merciless sheet. Fir trees wore white crowns that bent their backs with dignified patience, and the sky kept its light pale and distant, as if the sun had stepped away to think. Wind moved without hurry, shouldering through the timber and across the flats in long, steady breaths that lifted fine crystals into brief, glittering veils. Nothing here asked for witnesses. Winter held the land in a stillness so complete it seemed to have a voice of its own. On the rise above the creek, a small cabin shouldered into the weather like a thing built to endure. Its boards had grayed to the color of old promises. A narrow porch faced south for whatever warmth could be borrowed, and a path cut by habit and a snow shovel ran from the door to a stack of split wood arranged with military neatness. Inside, the air carried a clean smell of pine smoke and boiled coffee. A wool blanket draped a chair that had learned a single owner's weight, and a pair of well-used boots waited on a rubber mat for the next necessary task. It was a place set up for function and quiet. Nothing more, nothing less. Ethan Reeve moved through the cabin with the economy of a man who had learned the resourcefulness of routine. He had been a Navy SEAL long enough for the title to sink into his bones, and he had been retired long enough to understand that the title could not be peeled back out. In the mirror above the sink, the face that met him each morning wore the marks of distance traveled, weathered skin, a steady jaw, eyes the color of steel at first thaw. The hair at his temples had surrendered to gray early, and the lines at the corners of his eyes had been earned in desert glare and midnight seas. His body had not forgotten what it meant to carry weight with purpose, but his days no longer required the cost, and he paid his dues to the present with measured steps. Wherever Ethan moved, another presence matched the motion with practiced synchronicity. Atlas, a retired K-9 with a coat the shade of burnished wheat, tracked the small coordinates of Ethan's life with attentiveness that never spilled into anxiety. When the kettle hissed, Atlas's ears flicked once. When the log on the fire settled, he lifted his head and then let it return to his paws. When Ethan opened the door, Atlas took up position at the threshold, as if the world beyond needed a guardian's quiet opinion before it could be allowed in. Scars hid beneath his fur in places only careful hands knew, and in the set of his gaze lived the habit of reading a room before it spoke. The morning stretched on the axis of small tasks. Ethan checked the generator's line, swept a drift off the porch, and restacked 6 lengths of tamarack so their ends lined up like disciplined shoulders. He listened to the radio that lived on a hook by the door, its static a low companion that sometimes carried the weather service, and sometimes held only the breath of the land between stations. He noted the barometer's slow fall. He took the long way to the creek and back, breaking a narrow track with snowshoes and leaving a double line of clean impressions for the afternoon wind to soften. Atlas padded beside him, close enough to share warmth, far enough to leave room for thought. There were hours here when Ethan's mind emptied to the level of the present, and there were hours when it did not. The white of the valley could be a balm, a blank page upon which only the necessary was written: wood, water, heat, food, quiet. It could also be a mirror that reflected what the body remembered even when the heart did not volunteer it. A room grown too still after a blast, the pitch-black sea before a breach, the whistle of sand in a mouth too dry to swallow. He did not resent the memories. He managed them. He measured their weight the way he measured the split wood, kept them stacked where he could reach them and where they would not fall on him unexpectedly. By afternoon, the wind took a firmer hold. The sky settled into a colder shade that bled the warmth from distance, and the valley took on that faint metallic smell that says snow is being sharpened somewhere just out of sight.
Ethan let the fire fall to coals and swept the stove of ash. He cleaned Atlas's paws with a rag by habit, checking for ice or burrs, even though winter here offered few. He refilled the water pail, checked the radio's battery level, and laid out his next day's tasks in a neat line on the bench: oil for the door hinges, a new leather lace for the snowshoes binding, a sharpened knife wrapped in oiled cloth. The cabin's quiet took on density as the light shifted, not oppressive, just certain. Evenings in this valley were honest. They arrived without ceremony,
and asked little beyond readiness. Ethan drew the blinds to break the window's reflective pull and keep the room's heat from holding conversation with the cold. Atlas stood, circled once by the hearth, and settled with his chin on his paws. The radio's sound thinned to the fine-grain hiss of distance. Outside, the wind swung through the cottonwoods with a deeper voice. The stove ticked as the iron released what it was willing to give. The world simplified until each small noise could be named. In that pared-down soundscape, the first interruption arrived too faint to claim attention. A twitch of static, a stumble of nothing, the unformed suggestion of shape. Ethan's ear had been trained by years of listening to noise and learning to distinguish signal from it. He stilled without theatrics, letting his breath even out, and his senses lay flat like a palm against a closed door. The radio stuttered again, this time with a rhythm that did not belong to weather. Atlas lifted his head, eyes narrowing, body gathering into its ready posture without tension, the way a seasoned partner takes up a post before being asked. Ethan crossed the room in 3 steps and turned the volume enough to bring the edge of the sound into focus. Static bit, then opened a narrow seam through which a human presence pushed as if trying to force itself into the room. The voice, when it appeared, wore the ragged shape of cold and panic and failing equipment. Words did not arrive at first, syllables did, half-formed and torn by interference. The cadence was enough to mark urgency. The signal faltered, strengthened, broke, returned. Ethan's hand steadied the unit unconsciously, though he knew the fault was not in the box. He didn't ask for more. He didn't speak into the noise. He listened. Training has its own religion, and in this liturgy the prayer is patience. The voice threaded the static again, clearer by a fraction, and in the thin corridor of sound a string of numbers found its way through, a coordinate spine, clipped, staggered, but coherent enough to write. He reached for the pencil that lived beside the radio and laid the numbers down on the margin of yesterday's folded newspaper, checking them twice as the voice tried a second time and failed on the third. The cabin seemed to lean in. Atlas stood fully now, ears pointed, head turned toward the door as if the words had a compass, and it was his job to align to it. The wind pushed against the northern wall with a steadier hand. Ethan matched the numbers against the map in his head. The location settled somewhere along an old service road that ran too close to a line of gullies where snow drifted deep and mean. The radio gave one final strained exhalation of sound, and then the signal's spine snapped back into pure static, leaving the room with the taste of a half-finished sentence. As night gathers at the windows, the radio crackles once more, just long enough to drop a broken set of coordinates and a breathless plea before the line goes dead. Duty doesn't retire, it waits for the moment you can't ignore. The coordinates lay on the margin of yesterday's newspaper, like a quiet verdict, numbers strung together by a voice that had barely made it through the static. Ethan traced them once with a forefinger to let muscle memory fix them in place, and then unfolded the topo map from the drawer beneath the radio. The grid met the pencil with a resistance that felt familiar, an old skill waking up with the ease of a step taken on a remembered stair. The point resolved near an abandoned service road that threaded the western flank of the range, a place where snow drifted with a mind of its own and wind carved the drifts into hard, deceptive shapes. He stood motionless for a breath longer than habit would allow, then Egan. The deliberate ritual of preparation that had once been the difference between home and a name carved on a wall. He layered up without hurry, each piece chosen for use rather than comfort. Thermal base, wool, shell, gloves thin enough for feel and thick enough for survival, goggles to tame the white's fierce glare, a hat that held heat without blinding the ears to the weather's speech. Atlas watched from the hearth with intent that looked like stillness but was not. At the first rustle of the pack, the dog stood and moved to the door, not excited, not anxious, simply aligned. Ethan checked the contents on the bench. First aid kit, mylar blanket, 2 chem lights, spare batteries, a signal panel folded tight, paracord coiled like a small promise, a compact shovel whose handle locked with a reassuring click. He set a thermos in the side pocket and slid a small map case into the pack's lid where gloved, clumsy hands could reach it fast. The sky outside had moved from steel to pewter. Snow fell in dry, whispering grains that found seams and turned them into edges. The wind came low across the flats, then climbed into the timber with a tone that held patience and warning in equal measures. Ethan stepped into the track he had cut that morning and felt the world adjust its weight beneath him. Atlas took the point on the narrow path, pause finding the packed line, and then leaving it when the snowshoe trail disappeared under a drift, looping out and back in that calculated arc that say, ID. He knew how to read both scent and shape. The first 100 yards lengthened into purpose, the body recognized the pace, and the mind settled into the discipline that keeps a man small in the face of large things. Hesitation arrived as a thought he did not quite form. He had left this life for a reason. The valley had become a cure not because it erased the past, but because it placed it in a frame where it could not expand unchecked. He had come here to stop answering calls that owned him, to trade adrenaline for steadiness, chaos for tasks he could finish with his hands. But the distress in the voice that found him through static had made a demand more honest than memories. It had carried the sound of someone alone too long, in a place that could subtract a life without malice. He felt the old equation forming despite himself: distance, time, temperature, human limits, and he knew that his refusal to move would be a decision he would hear in the wind for years. The service road announced itself as a barely visible shelf cut into the side of the slope, its edges softened to curves by drifted snow. Ethan stepped onto it with care and felt the layer beneath the crust shift, a living thing that could support or betray depending on weight and angle. The map placed the coordinates a mile farther along, where the road swung toward a line of gullies that held cold like a secret. The wind hardened, the flakes grew larger and began to travel sideways, knitting the air into a cloth that wrapped the senses tight. Goggles turned the world into gradient and form. The sound of his own breath, disciplined and even, became the metronome that measured progress. Atlas tightened his pattern, moving in a deliberate zigzag across the road, nose low, then lifting to taste the wind as if scent were a topography of its own. Once he paused and looked back, and in the dog's eyes Ethan read not question but confirmation. The path they needed did not match the one men had carved with machines. Ethan trusted that reading the way he trusted his own hands. He left the road where it curved and followed Atlas onto a slope that fell away toward a shallow basin. Snow took the shape of the land beneath their steps, flattening where there was ground close, settling more slowly where air hid under crust. He probed with the pole before each placement, listening with the feet, allowing time for answers. As the basin opened, the wind met them head-on, collapsing distance into effort. Sound recessed. The world became breath, thud, grind, slide. The cold did its arithmetic at skin and lung and bone, but the body adjusted, found the calculation and worked within it. Ethan marked time by small checkpoints, a boulder half swallowed, a stand of saplings bowed into arches, the moment he stopped to drink from the thermos and felt heat enter like a remembered language. He glanced at the map case and then at the actual land and felt the alignment click again. The coordinates were no longer abstract. They hovered in front of him like a point the eye knows before the mind names. The battle inside him quieted, not from resolution but from an acceptance he did not argue with. He had left war, he had not left duty. The difference mattered. Out here duty did not dress itself in bravado. It measured boots against miles and judged a man's worth by whether he showed up with the right gear and a steady heart. He was not returning to who he had been, he was honoring what had shaped him into someone useful when usefulness meant life. The thought landed without fanfare and stayed, making room for focus to sharpen without pulling pride along with it. Atlas broke stride first. The change was not dramatic, it was a reduction. Speed lowered by a fraction, head dropped another inch, tail line steady instead of swaying. He tracked a short arc to the left, nose driving into a patch of wind-polished crust, then hopped back as the surface collapsed and exhaled a drift of powder like breath. He moved forward and pressed again, pawing with care, then stopped altogether and stood, front paws set, body angled toward the depression with a kind of certainty that needs no command. Ethan closed the last yards with control, placing each snowshoe where the dog's weight had already tested, sensing a hollowness beneath that warned of a pocket waiting to take him to the hip or worse if he got careless. He knelt and slid the shovel from the pack, hands working with a practiced economy that wasted neither motion nor heat. The first cuts into the crust made a sound different from snow, something in the pitch that tells the ear there is shape below. He widened the hole, keeping his weight distributed, Atlas shifting to the side to give room while keeping his nose angled to the seam. The cold pressed closer as if curious. The wind made a low, continuous chord around the basin's lip. Ethan's breath marked time, and the shovel kept time with it, both steady in a way that calmed the mind even as it crowded urgency forward. He cleared another layer, and the shovel edge struck against something that was not earth, not ice. A texture met the blade, fabric stiffened by freeze. He moved more carefully, scraping instead of cutting, brushing snow away with a gloved hand until a color that did not belong to the mountain emerged in a narrow stripe. He shifted to the other side and worked there, creating a second window into the same hidden shape. Atlas lowered his head and exhaled, a soft huff that fogged the edge of the opening, and vanished. Atlas halts, body rigid and eyes locked. Beneath the crust, fabric and a human outline take form. Something, someone, lies buried under the ice and snow. Buried in the snow was more than a man. It was a mirror to everything he once failed to save. The crust fractured under the shovel in clean, deliberate cuts, each stroke opening a window into white that wasn't empty anymore. Ethan felt the shift beneath the blade as clearly as a pulse under fingertips. That definite difference between earth and something human-shaped. Atlas held position at the edge, body aimed like a compass needle, breath fogging and vanishing in quick bursts that matched Ethan's cadence. Snow surrendered in slabs, then in shavings brushed aside by gloved hands until color returned to the world in a thin strip of dark fabric and a scrap of insignia stiffened by ice. The mountain did not resist the reveal, it simply watched with the indifference of weather while intention made its way through. The outline resolved piece by piece, and what had been a suggestion became fact. A shoulder emerged, then the angle of an arm held wrong, not by injury alone but by restraint. Ethan widened the cavity slowly, preserving the walls to hold back collapse, distributing his weight so that no sudden pressure would crush the air left inside. Atlas crept a step, and stopped as if a line had been drawn only he could see. When the glove found skin, it was too cold for sensation to travel at first, and then sensation flooded in with the brutal honesty of ice, a human arm encased in a soaked uniform sleeve, the fabric frozen to the form beneath it. He carved a trench along the torso and cleared the head, freeing the face from its frost mask. Blue lips parted around the shallowest breath, a vapor ghosting the air that would have been invisible without the dark of the opening to frame it. The eyelids fluttered without focus, and beneath one cheekbone a bruise darkened like a storm. Inside skin. A police badge pressed crooked against the chest where the coat had collapsed wrong, half buried in frost and grit, a sliver of shield catching the faintest light. The holster at the hip was empty, its leather marked by the absence it announced. Down at the wrists, plastic cinched into skin, a pair of zip ties turned brittle by cold and locked in a hard, accusing loop. Ethan's mind catalogued without commentary. He counted breaths and found a rhythm that barely qualified. He pressed 2 fingers against a carotid and felt a thread of life trying not to break. He scanned for blood and found no immediate spread that would cost seconds to search and longer to stop. The restraint at the wrists told its own story. This was not a hiker trapped by weather or a man caught by avalanche. Someone had arranged him for the elements to finish the work. The missing sidearm tightened the narrative. This was abandonment with the cruelty delegated to cold. Out here, that could be misread as indifference. It was not. The mountain had become a tool. Action took over because action was what he trusted when thought threatened to expand beyond usefulness. He cut the zip ties with a small blade and massaged feeling into hands that had no feeling left to receive. He slid the mylar blanket under the officer's back, creating a barrier between bone and ice, and tucked it up along the sides to hold whatever heat they might coax back. Atlas shifted to cover, eyes scanning the horizon of white as if the weather itself required a watchman. Ethan secured the officer's head and neck, listening for any complaint from a spine that had been held wrong too long, and found only the silence of numb tissue. Breath returned slowly under the shelter of the blanket and the discipline of steady handling. Ethan poured warm liquid from the thermos into the cap to steam the air near the man's mouth, letting heat be an invitation instead of a force. He checked for hidden injuries with the care of someone who understands that the body tells truth best when not hurried. The officer's chest stuttered and settled, the pulse threaded, vanished, returned. The face carried frost burn and the mark of restraint. The rest would announce itself later. For now, keeping the furnace inside him from going entirely dark mattered more than answers. The carry could not be improvised by will, it had to be engineered by method. Ethan anchored, The rescue sled he carried folded in the pack, a lightweight panel with webbing designed for exactly the work he had hoped never to do again. He rolled the officer carefully onto it, strapped him in with wide bands at hip and shoulder, patted the head against jolt and sway, and secured the mylar so that wind would not steal what little warmth remained. Atlas moved to the forward position like a teammate who knew the next line of the plan without being told. The basin's lip rose a long, patient climb away, and the cabin lived beyond that climb, a destination measure. Not in distance but in decisions executed correctly with no allowance for pride or haste. The wind pressed against them on the return like a memory that refused to stand aside. Fine snow slid along the surface in serpentine flows that hid ice beneath elegant movement. Ethan set the pace at a rate the officer's body could survive, short, strong pulls that distributed strain and kept heat where it needed to stay. He avoided the gullies that looked smooth but held air pockets and detoured around drifts hardened by compression. The sound of his own breathing created a rhythm Atlas matched with steady strides. In the world outside of this moment, time had all its usual features. Here, time had only one job, not to run out. On a shallow rise where the wind slowed just enough for thought to catch up, the officer stirred. It began as a twitch at the eyelids, then a ragged inhale that tried to find its way to steadiness and almost failed. The head moved under the padding by a fraction, a reflexive search for orientation in a world that offered none. The mouth opened without words at first, and then words arrived as the scraping of sound more than utterance. A name pulled up from somewhere inland and set loose in air that would barely carry it. It came out broken, a shard of identity that did not belong to this place and did not belong to this century either. Yet it landed with a weight that made the wind seem suddenly thinner. Ethan heard it as if it had been aimed at him from a distance no map could measure. Names have a geography of their own when they arrive this way. This one drew a straight line through years he had packed neatly and laid on a shelf high enough to ignore. It pointed to a room with no windows and a clock that had refused to move past a particular minute. Snow hissed across the crust, the harness creaked. Atlas turned his head as if the air had changed composition. Ethan did not slow and did not speed up. He did the next practical thing on the list, because practical things were the only reliable bridge between hearing and understanding. The officer's face slackened again into the economy of survival. The world narrowed to the rope in Ethan's hands, the snow under the sled, and the space between present and shelter. The cabin waited with its fire and its dry blankets and its radio that sometimes caught voices and sometimes did not. He climbed toward it with the deliberate efficiency of someone who has built walls not for keeping danger out, but for allowing what he shelters to remain human inside. Atlas led, pausing when the wind fell odd, adjusting when a subtle pitch suggested a hidden void, looking back when the pull line tightened or loosened in ways that mattered. The porch appeared as an interruption in white, a line and a shape that held promise at a scale the body understood. Ethan mounted the steps backward, hauling with a steadiness that turned strain into progress, then crossed the threshold and let the door latch shut against weather that would continue its indifference without him. Heat reclaimed air in expanding increments. He moved the sled beside the stove, maintained spacing to avoid shock, and began the slow work of bringing someone back in stages without forcing the body to sprint when it had forgotten how to walk. Tasks gathered and were dispatched, each one a small pledge kept. As warmth took hold, the officer's features gained detail from beneath their frost-stiff uniformity, and the badge caught light long enough for the engraved name to show itself before fog obscured it again. Ethan anchored in the present to prevent the past from requisitioning him entirely. The name that had clawed its way across frozen air did not leave. It carved a seat for itself at the center of his focus, uninvited, inevitable, vibrating with a significance he could not file away. He had heard it before, in a place where the night had taken men and kept some too long, and in a time when promises had felt like anchors that could hold any ship against any sea. The whispered name matched the one from Ethan's final SEAL mission, the teammate listed as missing, the man who was never found. Some ghosts don't haunt houses, they haunt your sense of duty. Heat returned to the cabin in quiet increments, the kind that never announces itself but proves its presence by what no longer hurts. The stove's steady glow pressed the chill back from the floorboards. Steam climbed from a damp wool hat set near the hearth. The windows shed their interior frost and cleared to a dull gray that admitted daylight without promising comfort. Ethan worked in a sequence that felt like muscle memory. Layers loosened, dry blankets rotated, warmed water offered in measured sips, core temperature raised without forcing shock into a body that had bargained with the cold too long. The officer's skin grew less pale, lips found a color not borrowed from the fire, and the chest rose in a more reliable cadence, a fragile rhythm that suggested a return rather than a retreat. Atlas settled at a diagonal by the stove where he could watch both the door and the man on the pallet, his ears taking turns with the window and the room, a living metronome set to vigilance. As the cabin regained its own breath, the past stepped through the unlatched door in Ethan's mind and took its seat without waiting to be invited. Memory is seldom linear. It arrives in fragments with their edges still sharp, and this day's fragments came from a place where light had been artificial and time measured in small, relentless units. The whisper in the snow had pulled a single name into the present, and with it came the remembered weight of a rucksack cut to essential, the disciplined economy of movement through a corridor where silence kept people alive, the geometry of a plan that held until it didn't. That final night overseas rarely showed itself whole. It preferred to return as sensations arranged like an unfinished map. He remembered the press of his glove against a steel frame cooled by desert air, the brief clamp in his chest when a timing cue lagged, the way a teammate's shadow shifted from the right place to the wrong place without asking permission. The extraction had been designed like a fine instrument. Redundancies, contingencies, margins, yet instruments rely on hands and human variables. What failed was not courage. What failed was the alignment of seconds that had to agree with each other. And in the sliver where they didn't, a friend vanished from the count, while the mission moved forward because it had to. Ethan had lived with the arithmetic ever since, the sum that didn't match the parts, the ledger that balanced on paper but not in the skin. He had brought everyone he could, and the desert kept one. That was the truth he had carried home. He had not argued with the war about outcomes, he had argued with himself about proportion. It was that private trial that sent him to the valley where snow simplified choices and the earth asked for a steadier kind of courage. Now the name had returned with frost on it, spoken by a stranger whose wrist still wore the memory of restraint, and it had rearranged the furniture in his mind. It wasn't just recognition, it was implication. People do not speak ghosts into existence by accident, and they do not speak them to men who once bore the same insignia unless the past is active and not archival. Ethan studied the officer's uniform in precise glances, memorizing details without prying meaning from them prematurely. The badge tilted at an angle reclaimed from ice, the stitching at the shoulder frayed by use, a smear of grit that suggested struggle in a place without asphalt. The missing sidearm said its own quiet sentence. The man had been placed in the snow by other men, and the snow had been told to finish what they began. The mountain had declined the assignment. The room's small sounds kept him anchored to the present, the whisper of the stove's draft, the soft tick of heat easing tension from a plank, the shift in Atlas's breathing when wind touched the eaves. The officer's temperature rose a fraction, a tremor left his hands, the jaw unclenched without instruction. Ethan matched each change with an action and a note held in mind, assembling a picture that had nothing theatrical in it and everything necessary. He had learned long ago that restoration is not a performance but a practice. Outside, the valley continued its own work, indifferent to the human arithmetic inside a single cabin. Wind slid along the frozen creek bed as if reading old tracks left before the day darkened. Snow thickened enough to blur trees into softer shapes without erasing them. The sky kept its pewter tone and held the horizon close, denying distance to eyes that might seek it for comfort. It was the kind of afternoon that suggests an early night, and the kind of weather that turns small distances into undertakings worthy of a plan. The connecting line between past and present formed not simply as chance but as a pattern, the officer's condition, the precision of his restraint, the missing weapon, the singular name. Ethan knew the difference between coincidence and design. The failed extraction had left more than grief behind. It had scattered questions that institutions prefer to label classified, and men prefer to fold into silence. If the officer had been investigating a corridor that led back to that night, then whatever had found him in the mountains had a memory and a motive. The officer's near-ending inside a weather event might be mistaken for misfortune by people trained to accept simple stories. It did not look simple to a man who had lived long inside complicated ones. He considered the edges of what he might do next without deciding. Decisions taken too quickly under the banner of compulsion tend to drag pride behind them. Decisions taken with care can still honor urgency. The radio might or might not return a signal through the storm. The road would not. The cabin had supplies enough for a night and a blanket of quiet strong enough to hold two men who needed time. Atlas lifted his head and turned toward the window, not in alarm but in adjustment, the way a compass needle moves a few degrees and stops with certainty. Ethan followed the gaze from habit, not curiosity. He did not need the view to confirm what the dog had already concluded, yet he looked anyway and let the shapes arrange themselves into meaning. Beyond the glass, the world had become layered in grays, and within those layers something moved with intent restrained by caution. It was not the skitter of branch against branch or the animal logic of a deer working a sheltered line. It was a rhythm that came from minds reading the same map, pauses measured to allow eyes to adjust, steps placed to distribute weight and avoid sound. Atlas went from attentive to taut, paws planted, shoulders rising, a small contained growl living in his chest like a warning designed for the room and not the wind. Ethan's own body did what it always does when a situation changes by a degree that matters. The heart did not sprint, it braced. The breath did not quicken, it lengthened. He rose without scrape or clatter and crossed the room in a way that left the air unruffled. He checked the latch with fingertips, noted the placement of items he had already put in order because order is what allows a person to choose rather than react. The stove glowed. The officer breathed. Atlas watched the door with a steadiness that made the word guard feel like a sacrament rather than a job. Outside, the moving gray took on the suggestion of form. One shape, then another, then a third, separated enough to see each other and close enough to act as one. They did not hurry. They did not announce. The storm gave them cover, and they accepted it as if they had practiced accepting gifts from weather before. The cabin's small square in the white drew them the way a fact draws conclusions when patience has run its course. Through the whiteout beyond the window, faint silhouettes resolve into three slow, deliberate figures moving toward the cabin, their approach measured by caution rather than chance. Snow hides many things, but never intentions. Ethan let the room darken until the stove's glow was the only living color left, and then he banked it to embers that warmed without announcing. The cabin absorbed the quiet with the ease of a thing built for weather and waiting. He moved like a man adjusting a compass, turning dials that only he could see, a glance to the officer's steadying breath, a hand to the latch confirming its silent cooperation, a shift of weight that kept the floorboards from speaking. Atlas rose from his post by the hearth in a single unbroken motion and took position at the rear of the room, head angled toward the back hall where a narrow mudroom opened to a door few people knew existed. The world outside pressed its cold palm to the windows. The glass held firm and offered nothing back. He did not need to guess the distance. He could hear it in the time between gusts and the way snow hissed against the wall. The figures in the whiteout used the storm as if it belonged to them, taking its cover and trading speed for control. Ethan lifted the pack he had half unpacked earlier and rebuilt it without rush, sliding in the essentials for a short disciplined absence. A compact headlamp wrapped in a glove to keep its first light dim, the shovel whose edge could be a lever or a probe, a small kit of tapes and markers that could lay a path without drawing attention, an extra mylar blanket folded down to the size of a pocket-sized promise, and the thermos he topped with water that held its heat because he had asked it to. He slipped the map case into the outer sleeve and looped the paracord around the pack's frame, then pulled on the shell whose seams he trusted when wind grew teeth. Atlas followed each preparation with eyes that made counting unnecessary. When Ethan moved to the back hall, the dog was already there, body aligned with the door, ears calibrating the storm's voice against the nearer sounds of men making their way across a drifted yard. The mudroom was a space designed for transitions, a narrow channel of peg hooks and rubber mat, and a shelf full of small things that kept larger things working, oil for hinges, wax for leather, a brush for snow caked in treads. Ethan paused long enough to run a hand over Atlas's flank and step into the boots whose laces had been set for this kind of exit. The door opened on a breath of air as cold as a kept secret, and then the two of them slipped outside, letting the night close the gap behind them without a sound to mark their passing. The storm accepted them like a tide taking back a shoreline. Ethan set a course along the cabin's northern wall where drifting was less severe, pressing from shadow to shadow as if darkness itself were the terrain. He moved with a deliberate cadence that translated training into restraint, the foot set without crush, the knee soft to distribute weight on crust that might hold or might decide not to, the breath timed to the wind so that exhale never carried past his own shoulder. Atlas adjusted to a half-step lead, weaving his body into the white with the efficient silence of a creature built to read invisible architecture. The first rise lifted them to a low shelf of ground that placed the cabin below and the tree line ahead. A vantage just high enough to see shape without offering theirs in return. Downyard, the figures approached the front of the cabin as if the door might answer questions the windows would not. Flashlights cut tight cones into the snow, their beams narrow and disciplined, the kind of light used by people who know how brightness reveals as much as it uncovers. The men's steps carried the cadence of experience, no floundering, no wasted corrections, each stride the length of a body measuring ground without counting. They paused at corners, one holding, two moving, then exchanging roles without words. The choreography lived in their training, not in the moment. Ethan watched the pattern long enough to be sure these were not locals out of place, they were professionals who had done this kind of approach and worse. He avoided lines of sight they weren't using yet, sliding higher along the ridge where spruce gathered into a windbreak, dense enough to filter both snow and sound. Every movement belonged to a principle. Avoid confrontation by denying its conditions. Minimize trace by layering your path over old scours. Preserve warmth by asking the body to work at a pace it can fund for hours, not minutes. He halted when the wind fell and moved when it rose, allowing the storm to cover his increments the way a tide covers prints. Atlas matched the rhythm perfectly, a silent metronome whose pause found the places crust would carry and avoided the hollows where one misjudged step could shout to the night through the tortured groan of ice. The men below fanned to the windows and then to the door, lights remaining low, beams sweeping short arcs that tested for response. When nothing answered, the trio repositioned and began a slow scan of the perimeter as if mapping the architecture of whoever lived there. How wood met stone, how steps faced the wind, where a boot scraper lived, where a trail usually emerged from a previous storm. Their caution announced more than their aggression could have. They were not hungry for noise, they were hungry for information, and hunger like that takes its time. Ethan considered the officer inside and measured possibilities he could influence against those he could not. The best strategy remained the one he had chosen at the first sight of Gray: widen the gap, preserve the unknown. Keep curiosity stronger than certainty in the minds of approaching strangers. Circling farther upslope, he crossed a narrow draw where the wind had scoured the ground down to a patchwork of rock and ice. At the leeward edge, a faint indentation broke the drift's smoothness. A small divot no animal would have made in this pattern, and a darker fleck punctuated the white where nothing else did. He eased closer on his forearms to avoid a collapse and reached for the object with fingertips, uncovering it with the side of his glove to keep snow from falling down into the depression. Metal met fabric and then separated, a small tag lifted free of a frozen ledge. Where it had snagged on a knot of root or twig and been held by the cold, he did not lift it to the headlamp. He turned his back to the wind and opened his cupped hands just wide enough to let the weak ambient light and the reflective sheen of snow make a surface for reading. The edges were familiar before the lettering came into focus, the oval cutout, the stamped spacing, the patina that tells a person metal has lived against skin in heat and sweat and fear. Stamped letters rose out of the dim with slow clarity. Unit numbers, blood type, a name that fit the space reserved for it as if the tag had never belonged to another. He felt the old muscle in the jaw tighten of its own accord and then release because tension wastes heat a man needs for larger tasks. From the ridge, Atlas lifted his head and tasted the air again, returning his gaze to the cabin where the lights traced their careful arcs. Ethan slid the tag into a pocket that closed with a whisper of Velcro, the soft kind that does not announce. He scanned the ground with a hand sweep and found a shallow scrawl in the snow where a glove had raked for purchase on the climb. A right-handed reach, a hasty correction, the kind of mark a man leaves when he stumbles on a slope whose angle tried to take him. He brushed the sign away, then smoothed his own prints with the tail of his coat where he could do so without drawing new lines. Below, the trio's search pulled them toward the outbuilding and the stacked wood, the kind of places people leave tools useful in a storm and the kind of cover men take when they intend to wait. Ethan tracked their timing against the wind and set a plan to bend his path back down the far side of the ridge to re-enter the cabin by the rear, giving the officer the advantage of his presence without signaling it to those who would prefer he be alone. The valley had its own loyalties. Trees that held wind for people who knew where to stand. Drifts that hid footsteps when asked politely by careful boots. Silence that kept counsel with those who spoke its language. He and Atlas began the return, with the same patience that had brought them out, letting the storm speak more loudly than any misstep might. At the ridge's crown he paused and took one last long measure of the figures below, committing their pattern to memory the way a navigator commits constellations to chart. Then he turned into the deeper shadows and let the mountain erase his presence one careful yard at a time, the dog at his side moving like an echo put to good use. Inside the pocket, the metal warmed against the heat his body refused to waste. The letters on it did not change with temperature. They had been stamped to last. He did not need to read them again to remember what they said, or to feel the past reconfigure itself into something active and unfinished. Snow might take prints and wind might carry sound away, but some truths resist weather with a stubbornness that looks like fate in the shelter of the trees. Ethan presses the dog tag into his palm and recognizes the stamped name and unit. His fallen teammate, the one listed as missing and never confirmed dead. He once swore he'd never lose another brother, and now the past was asking him to keep that promise. Warmth worked its careful way back into the room, as if the fire itself understood the difference between haste and help. The officer lay beneath a layered architecture of blankets and patience, color slowly returning to a face that had borrowed too much from winter. The stove whispered as it fed the air, the kettle purred, and the cabin found that steady, lived-in rhythm that turns a crisis into ordered steps. Atlas occupied his diagonal near the hearth, chest rising with measured certainty, eyes shifting between the man on the pallet and the door as though both were chapters in a book he refused to stop reading. Consciousness returned in fragments, not as a rush. The officer's fingers flexed like a message sent from far away finally finding delivery. A breath lifted and settled, the spine adjusted by a fraction that suggested sensation had re-entered its line. When the eyes opened, they did so with the cautious calibration of a pilot leveling a damaged craft, scanning the room's outlines, setting orientation by stove, window, and the steady figure beside him who looked more like a decision than a person. Recognition did not land in an instant. It unfolded. What came back first was not a name but a purpose, the compal. Sign to report, to continue, to place a piece into a pattern even if that placement cost the last of his reserves. Fragments arrived as information shaped by urgency rather than comfort, a string of missing names bound by the same kind of silence, each one a veteran who had shifted from service into a different uniform with fewer rules and more latitude. A private security group moving through contracts and countries like a shadow with a bank account, intersections with law enforcement investigations that started clean and then thinned to rumor. A line of inquiry climbing up into the mountains because one of those names had made a call he shouldn't have been able to make, and the call had pinged from a tower not used by travelers. Threads, not conclusions. Enough to know that someone had been looking where others preferred not to look, and enough to make that someone disappear. The details landed inside Ethan with the precise gravity of truth unadorned. He recognized the pattern not because of the acronyms scattered through it, but because of the cadence of betrayal buried within. The dog tag in his pocket served as a quiet weight against the past, an anchor to a name that had once belonged to a man whose absence had been explained as failure by systems that dislike untied knots. The unit number stamped into the metal did not argue, it simply stated, and in that statement lay the implication that the story everyone learned to live with had been an edited cut. If the officer had chased those edits into snow, it explained the restraints, the missing sidearm, the calculated accident curated by weather. Ethan moved through the aftercare with the same quiet authority he had used on the mountain, warming without shocking, hydrating without drowning, steadying without smothering. Atlas monitored each shift as if the room's geometry depended upon it, which in a way it did. The dog's presence lowered the temperature of fear, raised the floor of calm, and reminded the cabin that loyalty is more than a word, it is a posture, a willingness to keep watch even when nothing dramatic is happening. The truth of that posture felt like oxygen to a man who had known how quickly bravado spends itself and how long patience can work without applause. Reflection came uninvited but did not interrupt the work. Ethan accepted it the way he accepted weather. Felt, factored, neither indulged nor denied. He considered the idea of brotherhood beyond the easy rhetoric served at reunions and on recruitment posters, the kind that holds when contracts change and cameras are put away. He recalled faces in low light, the economy of gestures among men who had hauled each other across thresholds where failure becomes permanent, and he allowed the ache to pass through without naming it as weakness. The question that rose had no romance in it. What does loyalty owe the truth when the truth risks shattering the legends that once kept you moving? He knew his answer sounded simple because it had to be. Loyalty that cannot withstand light has always been allegiance to a lie. Outside, the storm adjusted its voice. Gusts shortened and regrouped. The whiteout pulled back a shade, enough to reveal the vague organization of the trees again. Snow fell in a steadier, less frantic pattern, the kind that settles instead of scours. The change left the cabin feeling momentarily larger, as if the walls had taken a deeper breath. Ethan used the pause to audit the situation with the discipline of a checklist. The officer was stable by degrees, but a hospital would need to be the next line written on the page. The figures outside had moved with professional caution. If they were still near, they were planning, not panicking. The tag in his pocket suggested this wasn't a random intimidation, it was a message with a signature. He let the realization mature without theatrics. Saving this man would place him inside the same crosshairs that had already been sketched on other names. The mountain offered no illusions that geography would hide him from a network willing to frost a badge and call it the weather's fault. He could return to a quieter narrative, burn the note in his pocket, and practice survival as a solitary craft. The alternative was to accept that the oath he once took had never been owned by an institution. It had always been owned by the part of him that refused to look away when looking away offered convenience. The cabin kept its calm even as the scale of the Choi Sea expanded. Atlas's gaze met his with the unspoken agreement of a teammate who never asks for certainty and always insists on clarity. In the space between breaths, the room arranged itself around intention. A plan did not need to be grand to be effective. It needed to be exact. The first task was medical: keep the officer's body on its upward curve, prevent recooling, guard against the quiet crises that return when vigilance sags. The second was informational: consolidate the fragments into a sequence that another responder could verify. The third was environmental: reduce signatures, mask presence, and read the land for approach vectors that might trail back to the ridge where he'd found the tag. Every item on the list carried risk, none involved noise. Force was the last instrument in a drawer full of better tools. He prepared the radio with the respect owed to a device that sometimes opens doors and sometimes invites wolves. He rigged a makeshift antenna extension, angling it low and short to avoid broadcasting bravado to the valley. He aligned the power to pulse rather than stream, intending to trade volume for persistence. He tuned to the frequency locals shared for emergencies that didn't fit neat categories and let his finger hover over the transmit as he counted heartbeats to keep time. Atlas stood now, leaving his heat by the stove to occupy a post closer to the radio's table, the way a guardian leans toward the next hinge that might move. The officer stirred, not in pain, but in reaction to sound that had not yet been made, as if the body remembers a message before the air carries it. Ethan's thumb lowered, met the switch, and lifted again, testing the pulse. Static answered and fell away. He tried once more, letting the signal out with a restraint that sounded like discipline if anyone were listening who knew the difference. The cabin stayed steady. Then the burst arrived, not from him but to him, clipped and urgent, carrying no signature beyond its compression. It did not say a name, it did not need to. The tone alone conveyed that the hunt no longer relied on chance and that the map had acquired a marked point where none had been before. The room's temperature did not change. The decision did not flinch. Atlas lifted his head and angled it toward the door. A tight-coated transmission snaps through the frequency with brutal clarity, confirmation that the cabin's position has been acquired and that the search has shifted from guessing to finding. True courage isn't about fighting. It's about refusing to give up when everything tells you to. The transmission's clipped certainty settled over the cabin like a second weather system, invisible but heavy. Ethan acknowledged it with the quiet of a man who understands that preparation is not panic, it is respect. He moved through the room in a measured circuit that transformed shelter into sanctuary without hardening it into a bunker. Curtains were drawn not to hide, but to keep light disciple. In. The stove was fed to a low, constant pulse, enough to protect the officer's core temperature without throwing a beacon through seams. A kettle warmed and waited, the simple promise of heat ready to be poured into whatever container the next hour required. He rechecked the officer's vitals and adjusted the blanket layers with the precision of a craftsman rather than the haste of a fugitive. A chemical heat pack slid beneath the pallet where it could work quietly. Water was rationed into intervals the body could absorb. Every small decision bent the arc of the night toward survival. Atlas paced a slow perimeter between door, pallet, and the corner where the radio lived, pausing at each threshold as if blessing it with attention. When the dog settled, it was never for long. Vigilance rose and fell on a rhythm older than training, the kind fidelity that needs no command. The cabin's defenses were not weapons, they were arrangements. Ethan shifted a shelf unit to create a narrow choke of space that discouraged a rush without inviting a fight. He cleared sightlines to the back hall, not to provide fields of fire but to ensure movement could be controlled if strangers mistook entry for victory. He laid out a coil of paracord, a roll of tape, a strip of reflective paneling cut thin, a kit of tools designed to guide rescuers and confuse pursuers when the moment to separate those two streams arrived. He checked the rear latch again and left the mudroom swept of prints, as if the W. Ind had always owned it. On the radio, he tuned away from fear and toward function. The antenna extension he'd rigged earlier reached just enough beyond the cabin's shadow to find a stubborn edge of sky. He pulsed the signal again, then again, using the patience of a lighthouse keeper rather than the urgency of a drowning man. In each short transmission he pressed the officer's coordinates, condition, and the caution that hostile elements might be near. He spoke into the method, not the storm, trusting that method carries farther than noise. Between pulses, he listened, letting silence return to its work. Outside, the blizzard found its stride and held it, wind shouldered against the eaves with the relentless strength of something that is forgotten it can end. Snow rattled across the windows and then hissed down the walls. Time loosened its numbers and stretched into longer measures. A minute became the distance between gusts. An hour became the cycle of tending fire, checking breath, feeling the dog's quiet move, and the officer's slow stabilization. In this kind of night, courage was not a flare, it was a pilot light. Ethan guarded it the way a man cups flame in his hands while crossing a dark field. The presence outside announced itself in negative space, a geometry of absence rather than intrusion. No knock, no shout, only the subtle misalignment of wind where figures displaced air, the faint pressure change when a body leans against the weather and the weather pushes back. Somewhere beyond the front steps, snow shifted with intention. Somewhere near the woodpile, a pattern of scuff and stillness wrote itself in a language the storm did its best to erase. They circled the perimeter as if tracing a maze, not in ignorance but in caution, testing for rashness they did not find. If they expected panic to telegraph itself through a slammed latch or a shouted warning, they learned that patience was already resident here. Ethan's resolve found its uses in restraint. He refused the temptation to meet shadows with force. He replaced it with the discipline of removing chances for contact. When the wind rose, he moved, adjusting the officer's position by inches to keep circulation honest, not allowing cold to reclaim what the fire had won. When the wind fell, he stilled, letting silence swallow footfalls and thought alike. Atlas stood in those pauses, body straight, ears high, tail a steady line, as much a part of the cabin's load-bearing structure as the beam over the door. The dog's presence reminded the room that loyalty can hold a boundary without hardening into threat. The rescue pulses finally found their answer in the faintest echo, a distant acknowledgement shaped like a life ring skidding across black water but catching nevertheless. It carried no comfort beyond confirmation, yet confirmation is sometimes all endurance needs. Ethan mapped timing against weather and calculated ranges against fuel. He pictured a flight path skating between mountain. The way a blade glides across ice, arriving not when anyone wished, but when physics allowed. He marked a window in his head and set his patience inside it, the way a craftsman sets a piece of glass into a frame, careful not to crack what he intends to protect. Outside, the circling drew tighter and then widened again, the way predators test fences without jumping them. A tap of light brushed the far side of a window and moved on. Snow softened even that into suggestion. The night kept its counsel, and the men beyond the walls kept theirs. The cabin became a small country governed by a single law: hold. Ethan obeyed without resentment. His hands remained steady, his breath remained level, his mind refused to rehearse dramas that would never be permitted to take the stage. Hours wore their quiet grooves. The officer slept without slipping, body answering the questions he'd asked of it with better and better sums. Atlas dozed in fractions, waking at intervals only the storm could count. Ethan fed the stove by small degrees and nursed the radio's battery with thrift a banker would admire. He drank in sips and ate in motions so economical they barely registered as acts. This was not endurance performed for an audience, it was endurance as craft. The wind began to step down out of its fury, not to quit, but to tire in a way that alters sound. The intervals between gusts lengthened, and in those slim corridors of relative quiet, the valley allowed other noises to exist. Snow settle. D from hiss to sift. A branch, overburdened, shrugged and dropped its load with a soft thud. Somewhere far to the west, a shape moved against the broader silence in a way that did not belong to weather or footfall. Ethan lifted his head. Atlas lifted his before, angling his ears toward a frequency people rarely hear first. It arrived the way distant memory sometimes does, faint at the edges, then certain in the center. The pulse of rotor blades threaded the dark, not loud but undeniable, a mechanical heartbeat carried on air that had finally made room for it. Rescue was not here, rescue was coming, which in nights like this is the same as a promise written in pencil by a hand that intends to press hard enough to make the mark permanent. Ethan exhaled once, not in relief but in acknowledgement of the next sequence taking shape. He walked to the mudroom and looked, at the door he had used to leave without trace and return without drama. He measured the distance between the cabin and the tree line where footprints turn into guesswork. He pictured the figures outside recalibrating at the first hint of a helicopter's low approach and turning their circle into a line. He understood the math. The safest outcome for the officer would require fewer variables in the room when uniforms crossed the threshold with urgency and questions. The night had been long, the next minutes would move quickly. He set his choices in order the way he set kindling, ready to take flame when flame was off air. D. Through the roar of wind, the thin thump of rotor blades grows from rumor to root, and as the first sweep of light ghosts across the distant pines, Ethan knows he will guide rescue in, then vanish into the storm before anyone can say his name. Sometimes saving another life is how you finally save your own. Morning arrived as if the night had been a long-held breath finally released. The storm stepped back from the valley and left its work in clean, deliberate lines, tree limbs stacked with porcelain weight, drifts rounded into silent dunes, a sky rinsed to a pale clarity that seemed almost new. Light crept over the ridge and laid a thin gold along the roofline of the cabin, revealing the small human geometry of a place that had chosen to endure rather than impress. The air sharpened to a brightness only cold can make, and sound carried with a precision that turned distances into honest measures. The helicopter came in low along the crease of the mountains, its blades thudding a slow, certain cadence that stitched the far horizon to the clearing yard. Snow fanned out beneath it in patient circles as the machine angled toward a clearing that had not existed the day before and now looked as if someone had planned it months in advance. Rescuers dropped into the morning with movements tuned to purpose, their presence folding into the scene with professional grace that carried no theater, only method. They crossed the threshold with heat packs and measured urgency, reading the room the way skilled hands read a pulse, and found the officer alive at a distance the night should have made impossible. They moved through steps arranged in the exact order needed: stabilize, protect, prepare to lift. Outside, the sky brightened to a harder blue as if agreeing with the plan. In the liminal minutes before questions take shape, the cabin felt briefly like a chapel. Breath condensed in clean threads, blankets held steady warmth, and the stove gave a final hush of approval, as if passing stewardship to newer hands. Ethan stood in the only space left to him, a margin he had arranged on purpose, and let the scene accept its rightful actors. The geometry of his absence needed to be as careful as the geometry of his presence had been. Atlas understood the shift without instruction. The dog slipped into the mudroom, and then into the small run of furs that began behind the shed, every step landing in the night's old depressions, as if the storm had left him a map by design. Ethan followed, not hastily and not slowly, shoulders aligning with the tree trunks, boots finding the tame hold of crust that would not betray the progress with sound. The wind carried the helicopter's pulse in steady threads. It also carried the voices of men doing their work well. He moved until the cabin fell into the pattern of the larger valley again, a simple shape among other simple shapes. The way it had been before the night demanded it become a stage. From the ridge, he turned once and let the sight register, not pride, not regret, just a completeness that settles when a thing has been done in proportion to its need. Then he and Atlas slipped into the long line of trees and let distance convert certainty into rumor. The days that followed rearranged themselves into the old order with small, undeniable changes. Snow melted from the south face of Stones first. The creek opened its mouth beneath a gray lid and spoke in quiet syllables, and the trail regained the shallow grooves that announced repetition. News traveled faster than thaw, reaching towns long before the ice released its hold on shaded roads. At a diner with steamed windows 3 valleys away, people scrolled grainy photos and clean bulletins. An officer found bound in the mountains, alive against odds that are usually indifferent. A helicopter crew citing timely coordinates provided by an unknown party. The mention of a K-9 somewhere between rumor and praise. The phrase, mystery rescuer, attached itself to the story like a ribbon someone else had tied. Ethan returned to the lake cabin when the roads trusted tires again. The surface of the water still iron but no longer sealed. Pines made their slow music in the wind, and the porch boards remembered his weight without creak or commentary. He put his hands back to the small repairs winter always gives as offerings to those who stayed. A hinge that protested until oil convinced it to forgive. A strip of weather stripping that had lost its will and needed replacing. A length of gutter that leaned like a tired shoulder. These were acts that earned their keep immediately. They returned warmth or quiet or function as soon as he finished them. Atlas lay by the threshold with that attentive ease that does not relax so much as it settles into readiness, content to inventory the day with his eyes. Peace did not return as an absence, it returned as a configuration. The right objects in the right places, the right noises at the right volume, the right responsibilities claimed without request. Yet beneath the arrangement lived a new current that did not disrupt, it activated. He felt it in the way his morning path lengthened by a few steps, as if the body wanted slightly more horizon. He felt it in the way his hand rested a heartbeat longer on the radio's dial, not to tune, only to acknowledge that sound carries when it needs to. He felt it most sharply in the space where guilt had lived like a permanent tenant. That space had not emptied, but it had changed shape, its edges sanded by something like proportion. Saving another man had not amended the ledger of the past, it had made a different ledger possible. The letter arrived on a Tuesday that had the clean sameness of a finished winter. It waited on the porch just past the mat, protected by the lip of the roof, plain and without return address. The paper held the modest weight of a thing that knows it does not need decoration to matter. Inside, the handwriting moved with the careful steadiness of someone still learning the contours of his strength again. The message was short and exact, the kind of sentence an officer might write when he cannot afford to overspend words. You didn't just save me, you saved yourself. The ink had bled a little where a drop of melted snow, or a different kind of salt, had tested the paper's fibers and found them faithful. Ethan laid the note beside a small set of objects that had begun to form their own quiet altar. A paracord bracelet with frayed ends, a folded map with a crease deepened by use, a brass coin that had less value as currency than as memory. He did not assign the letter more meaning than it offered. He let it stand within the space it had claimed. Atlas bumped the edge of the table with his nose. An absent-minded blessing, or a request that morning be continued, in practical duties, and Ethan answered with motion. He stepped out onto the porch and let the day take his measure. The lake held a skin of la ice that trembled under a light wind, neither fixed nor free, promising a thaw it had not yet granted. The pines traded whispers newcomers cannot interpret, and old residents rest in. Across the water, a bank of cloud lifted its hem and showed the darker line of a far ridge. Time, which had expanded and contracted according to crisis, resumed its slower tick and asked nothing more than attention. He gave it freely. Behind him, the cabin kept the heat he had built. Before him, the shoreline drew a long line that curved toward another season. The world does not usually offer signs formatted so a person cannot miss them. It prefers subtler methods that can be mistaken for coincidence unless someone is listening for a frequency most people don't know exists. Ethan stood in that listening without forcing it, hands at his sides, breath level, the dog a warm presence against his knee. The wind ran down the inlet and picked up bits of sound the way a river collects light. It gathered something from a distance that no ear would insist it heard, and yet no heart could ignore, a faint pattern that resembled a call sign once used by a team that had spent its courage carefully and its noise reluctantly, a sequence worn into the skin like a prayer. Ethan looks out over the lake. The wind carries the faint sound of a SEAL team call sign. He closes his eyes, finally at ease. If this story made you feel that quiet heroes still walk among us, then don't let it end here. Share it with someone who believes loyalty never dies. Every act of courage deserves to live beyond the moment it happens. And tell me one thing before you scroll. Do you think true redemption comes from saving others, or finally forgiving yourself?